All right, again. Hello, my friends, my 5G into the abyss spelunkers, the team of people who spend a lot of time listening to dense text in the beautiful summertime when they'd rather be outside. But it's important that we spend our time, at least 30 minutes of it, looking beyond the comforts of isolation, where we sit around and stare at our phones and drink iced coffee, and read some people who actually have thought a little bit more or couldn't help but stare directly into, as Witkacy says, the great mystery. So I'm trying to do a little bit of that, or at least pay homage to it through reading the words of these people. And so today I continue again with one of my favorites, the Polish writer, the consummate anti-everything human being, philosopher, artist, playwright, the man behind me with the jacket over his head, Stanislav Ignacy Witkiewicz, aka Witkacy. I'm reading today again from an online source, but it is the directly out of the Witkacy Reader, translated by Daniel Gerould. It is a compilation of Witkacy's philosophy, some plays that he wrote, letters that he wrote between his dear friend Bruno Malinowski, I think his name is, and wonderful just anxiety, metaphysical anxiety throughout. So today I'm picking up again with his piece of fiction that's entitled The 622 Downfalls of Bungo, or The Demonic Woman. I'm picking up with chapter 2. And just to give you some perspective, this was written in 1910 and 1911. So forgive me as I grab the text. All right. The 622 Downfalls of Bungo, or The Demonic Woman, by Stanislav Ignacy Witkiewicz, aka Witkacy. Chapter 2. The story of an insignificant downfall. In parentheses, Bungo's theory and practice of art. Close parentheses. A fundamental transformation started to take place in Bungo's artistic practice. If up until then he had painted only decorative canvases in which extrinsic elements functioned solely as pretexts, now, under the influence of recent experiences, more and more place in his creative work was given to the composing of certain psychic states, incapable of being precisely analyzed in a form of composition, which, qua composition, i.e., as an arrangement of lines and colors, was gradually becoming nothing more than a means of expression and not a self-contained entity. This gave rise to works that Bungo, while attributing a certain value to them, did not acknowledge as pure art. In his view, art was really pure decoration. The idea of a pure work of art, in his opinion, must remain foreign to any connection with real life and flow solely from the laws governing the colors and lines themselves, whose combinations and constructions were to present a world absolutely self-contained, which would be, according to his former theory, the direct reflection of the transcendental unity of being. Everything that exists contradicts the principle by which it exists, i.e., the principle of transcendental unity. Art, in such a system, existed without contradiction as a manifestation of the absolute unity of being in pure form. Then, under the influence of his reading of Mach and Cornelius, which Nevermore had prescribed for him as an antidote to the metaphysical nonsense, Bungo modified his metaphysics, but he did not fundamentally change his theory of art. Now, life had burst into his most essential creative work, and although he was somewhat uneasy on that score, he let himself be borne along by this inner current and waited to see what would result from it. Just as an aside to the reader, listener, Bungo is a thin veil for Witkacy's own self, and the Duke of Nevermore is a thin veil for his friend Malinowski. I continue. He was unable to observe anything demented in his psychic states, and yet he sometimes felt that he was completely alienated from himself, and he began to fear that he might end, imperceptibly and without realizing it himself, in madness. This thought actually increased his anxiety. He worked frantically, but his composition, seemingly created by a strange kind of fluid without the participation of his will, became for him living symbols of the progressive decomposition of his healthy, vital energy. Pure decoration ceased to exist for him. Chapter 3, The Ball in Burnham Palace and Its Consequences. No longer able to tolerate grandes dames and pseudo-artists, Edgar was frequenting, with Rixenberg and Spleeney as his constant companions, the highest circles of the impoverished intelligentsia. He had become involved in a complicated and abnormal affair with a former classmate of his at the university, Miss Saphir, who was a sadist at an embryonic stage of development. She confined herself to clipping the blasé Duke's nails till his fingertips bled, while he writhed in exquisite pain and used his tongue to lick her convex and, as he himself said, repulsive belly button. Only Rixenberg held back, although his mania for hypnotizing young ladies and forcing them into various autoerotic perversions was beginning to seem slightly paranoid. Under these circumstances, even Spleeney got over his bad case of facial acne and took on the appearance of a stud bull. Bungo alone, free of all real desires, tagged after the Duke like his shadow, observing the degenerate faces of his friends and immortalizing them in his paintings and drawings, which, in contrast to the impotence afflicting him in real life, evolved more and more toward perverse pornography. One night, Bungo saw the Duke back to Burnham Palace. Edgar was so unnerved by the sadism of his girlfriend Saphir that he begged Bungo to come home with him because he felt that he could not stand to be alone, but was ashamed to wake his footman. Bungo agreed all the more readily since he hated his own room and regularly sought excuses to spend the night elsewhere. The Duke's laboratory was located in a large salon on the second floor. It also housed his bedroom in a little recess in the wall, in a kind of alcove. Above the bed, there hung a dark cherry canopy with the curtains open, and it was all permeated with the scent of California poppy, the Duke's favorite perfume. The salon was exceedingly strange to behold. The disorder that reigned in the Duke's chalet in Bukovina had been transferred to the palace, but on a much larger scale. There were enormous tables covered with complicated instruments, glass cases gleaming with rows of jars containing chemical reagents or books in sumptuous bindings, a fine set of furniture in the Biedermeier style, a pile of red mattresses, a gasoline motor that powered a small dynamo, a collection of storage batteries, and a model airplane hanging from the ceiling, not counting a vast number of the most disparate small objects. A striking characteristic of the salon was the total absence of any work of art. "Dear Bungy boy," said the Duke, lighting an arc lamp equipped with a green glass chimney, "I'm exceedingly grateful to you. You would not believe how rotten I feel when I am alone. You can have my bed and I'll sleep on the mattress." "It will be a pleasure for me to stay with you tonight," Bungo answered, having no desire to begin a discussion about creating one's life. "I simply can't stand my own room." The Duke placed a mattress several feet from the alcove and began to undress slowly. Then he washed in the tub and suggested that Bungo do the same. It was terribly hot in the room. Edgar was now squatting on the mattress, absolutely naked and smoking a cigarette. He suddenly tossed it aside and began to examine his injured hands. Then he gave a start, as if he wanted to get up, but did not move. He sat with his back slightly turned toward the alcove, but in such a way that Bungo could see his shortened profile. Bungo undressed quickly, hoping to fall asleep right away. However, Edgar's movements made a strange impression on him, and he began to watch him closely. Edgar started again, and this time got up, turning his back to Bungo as he did so. He remained standing that way for a moment, as though he wanted to overcome a strong urge. His arms were partly bent and his fists clenched. Suddenly he turned around, stepped off the mattress, and began to go toward the alcove. "What are you thinking about that makes you so excited?" Bungo asked with a laugh, having noticed a certain fundamental change in the Duke. The latter did not respond, but suddenly switched off the lamp that lighted the alcove and looked at Bungo. The laughter froze on Bungo's lips. The Duke's face was frankly atrocious. His parched lips were half open in an imbecilic smile. His eyes, without glasses, were hazy and had a confused look of criminal desire, mute supplication, and repulsive sorrow. For a split second, Bungo looked at him with artistic satisfaction. That face, almost alien to him at the moment, resembled the demonic figures in his drawings. But at almost the same moment, he saw everything clearly, and something so hideous gripped him that he was suddenly paralyzed with fear. At times, he felt strongly tempted to commit acts that were contrary to his innermost essence and potentially ruinous. When traveling by rail, for example, he often had to restrain himself forcibly from reaching into his pocket and throwing all his money and identification papers out the window, or from blurting out some choice obscenity in the presence of proper matrons and staid elderly gentlemen. And there were other, more menacing temptations that concerned the most important questions of his life. At this moment, reacting to the Duke's penetrating gaze, he fell prey to a temptation of precisely that kind. But it was so powerful, so seductively criminal that he realized the futility of any resistance, and at the same time knew that something that could ruin his entire life and decide his entire fate had to happen. "Want to?" he asked in a voice he hardly recognized as his own. The Duke gave a slight nod of assent. "Got those things?" Bungo asked again. "Otherwise, nothing doing," he added with a touch of disgust in his voice. "Oh, look," the Duke answered, feeling that he must act quickly before the moment passed. They both spoke softly, rapidly, and yet calmly and coldly, like people threatened by danger. Moving with the stealth of a hyena, Edgar ran over to the little stand and began searching. Bungo waited, transfixed, in a terrible state of tension. So after all, there was something that could shake him to his very depths. That thought was almost a source of satisfaction. The Duke came back. "There aren't any," he said, utterly at a loss, his voice filled with gloomy, hopeless desire. But now Bungo pursued his scheme. "Then let it be perversion, and I demand my turn later on," he said coldly, as though bargaining in a store. "All right. Word of honor? Word of honor." "Put out the light," Bungo whispered. The Duke turned off the light and slipped under the canopy. The dim greenish rays of another lamp sifted down from above. An hour later, it was already dark in the Duke of Nevermore's workshop. The only light that filtered through the blinds of the large windows was the barely perceptible glimmer of the street lamps, which reached up to the second floor. The noise of urban life in the outlying factory districts could be heard in the distance, and only from time to time was the relative silence interrupted by the sound of a train rushing by on a branch line or the plaintive whistle of a locomotive. Bungo was lying in bed by himself, his eyes open, totally unable to understand what had actually happened. A few minutes later, he had a strange impression. He saw the city in three-dimensional space, but everything in his vision was flat, two-dimensional, and moved in only one direction. Automobiles, wagons, streetcars, and people went along parallel lines, and between them there was the impassable void of the third dimension. Bungo felt that he too was flat, and he moved ahead without knowing how, parallel to all the rest. Then he drifted off into a heavy sleep without dreams, and when he awoke, it was already bright daylight. A tiny little beam of sunlight streamed through the only chink in the blind, opposite the alcove, marking out its path in the dusty air and making a bloody spot on the edge of the red mattress, on which Edgar was sleeping, on the floor. From the first, Bungo felt that something bad had taken place, but he did not know what. It all came back to him in a flash, and the pain of the loathsome act that once done could never be undone crushed him beneath its monstrous weight. He suddenly saw his whole life pass before his eyes, and Isis above all stood out with frightening clarity. And now he would have given anything in the world had the events of the night been only a dream. For a moment he tried to believe it had never happened, and that he had been the victim of a repellent hallucination. But he looked to the right. The ray of sunlight had just reached the lower half of the sleeping Duke's face. Nevermore's mouth was half opened and colored scarlet by the reflection from the sun, while his eyes and part of his nose remained engulfed in the shadows. The impression made was of an innocent little boy wearing a mask. With a speed that seemed frightful to Bungo, the ray of sunlight rapidly disclosed more and more of Edgar's face. Finally, it touched his eyes. The Duke suddenly awakened and stretched on the bedding. His face, all squinted up because of the light, now resembled that of a prematurely born embryo. Bungo felt such frightful hatred for the Duke that for a moment he had to restrain himself from leaping out of bed and scratching the monstrous little face he saw in the light of the sun. He closed his eyes briefly and pretended to be asleep. The act, once done, confronted him as a reality that cannot be revoked, and Bungo had to look it straight in the eye. All the same, it was a crime, he thought with childish satisfaction. His habit of drugging himself with whatever came his way reasserted itself even at this wretched moment, and he felt a sense of relief. He heard Edgar washing in the tub and snorting loudly. And then, as he dried himself, he moaned softly all the while. Bungo was seized with a sudden fury. He leapt out of bed and immediately cooled off. When the Duke turned toward him, he seemed a total stranger, and a rather likable one at that. They said not a word to each other, except a formal good morning. Bungo hastily splashed cold water over his face and body, and even felt that the events of the night had agreeably jolted his blasé mechanism for receiving external impressions. I'm curious what Brummel will have to say about this, he thought as he dried himself with a soft, thick towel. No matter what, it was an experience. And that is the end of the excerpts from the 622 downfalls of Bungo or the demonic woman. There's a little passage here about the life of Witkacy. It's a very tumultuous life. And like I said, these two characters are thin veils for himself and his close friend and confidant, just making sure it's Malinowski and Bruno or Bronio Malinowski. So for now, I leave Witkacy. Witkacy has amazing pieces of text, but I will leave them for you to discover. And we will move on to another writer in our next meeting. Thank you for joining the 5G Into the Abyss, and we will see you again on the edge, the precipice of the cliff. Goodbye.